Okay. So the video was mostly just talking about creativity and the different states that our human brain can be in and how we differ from other species. And he mentioned that creativity is not just like something that we like have. It's not just like a trait, but it's like an actual state that our brain goes into, and it's different from, and it like in itself is like not its own emotion, but like every single time our brain experiences a new emotion, it's in a new state.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with creativity. So creativity has its own state of mind, separate from everything.
Right. So the interesting thing when he was talking about states was he used the example of like a man, like a person with Parkinson's disease, and how even like essentially everything your brain is doing could be called like a state of your brain. And so the Parkinson's brain state is when the cells are firing in a different order, in a different order, in a different rate than what like a normal brain would be.
Because like he mentioned, like whenever you have like a normal brain, it's kind of like it's firing, and then it like will stop periodically. But like with the Parkinson's brain, it's more broken up, it's a lot more choppy, and it explains like kind of like the tremors, because you don't have that same fluid movement, because your the axons aren't firing at the same rate.
Right.
Bulls.
Yes, so man, that really threw me off. We can edit that out, right?
No, I think I'm just gonna post it.
Okay. Sorry, Janny.
Hi, Janny. We got interrupted.
Anyways, yeah, so the interesting thing about when he was talking about creativity was that creativity is such a unique thing to humans.
Yes.
And the closest like thing to human creativity, I guess, would be the ape. He talked about the ape Congo, right? Was that her name? Congo. And how even, she showed like an ounce of the creativity that is found in most humans, and talking about how like even looking at ancient like cave drawings and statues and all of these things, how creativity has always been such a uniquely human thing, which I also think is interesting, because even if I think back to like when they did cave drawings, like their main goal was survival. Like now we're not worried about like hunting for food, and we have loads of time to be creative, but even in this time of just trying to survive and live and not die, know, they had this like draw to be creative and this desire to be creative, which is so uniquely human.
Yeah. Another thing about that, like the way that he was talking about it, is that I think that the reason why we do have that, he mentioned that it's not because our brains are significantly bigger than monkeys or other animals, but it's more that we have the largest number of cells, and he referred to the neurons as microchips.
Yeah.
He said we have the largest number of microchips, and that is how we're able to possess these unique state of minds compared to the other creatures. Because we have such a large number of neurons, and we have like such a large number of synapses and connections, and we're able to really bridge the gap between our like all of our brain functions, while as like with animals it may be more limited.
Yeah. And I thought it was really interesting when he was talking about the interconnectivity of our brains specifically, and how everything functions alongside and helps everything, which I think is, I don't know, I just thought that was really fascinating too.
Yeah, like he mentioned, he used the example of like a glass.
Yeah.
Like we don't just like see a glass and then like talk about or like be like, oh yeah, that's a glass. Like we use like, it's not just visual information. It's like this is a glass and we use it to drink, and we can do it for this. Like we see everything as more of a bigger picture than as just like just the visual information that we're receiving. Like we're able to see an object for what it is and what its purpose is, instead of just what it looks like.
I thought the other cool and like kind of funny thing he talked about too was referring to neurons as like being noisy, which I thought was really interesting. Just the constant like state of like movement and like continual information in and out, and even talking about how creative people tend to be like feverish more often, which I thought was really, I don't know, it's just like funny and interesting, you know, that idea of our brains are just like constantly noisy and sending all this information to create these creative states, you know.
Also, like, another thing that he mentioned is that, like, after we activate, like, certain areas of our brain, we can become better. So it's almost like what we talked about in our neuro lecture the other day, where it's like you use it and you improve it. And so, like, once we activate it and once we actually start using it, we can continue to become better in it the more we pursue that. And so he talks about art and science and how you can conjoin things that way, and how we can become better as a species by moving forward and being more active in learning in that way.
Yeah. And I think too, going again back to the Parkinson's thing, thinking about the brain being in states can be so effective when it comes to therapy, to speech therapy, and audiology. When that Parkinson's example was really fascinating because they talked about how in order to change the Parkinson's brain state back to a normal brain state, they put essentially like a pacemaker for the brain in, and it changed that rate in the same way a pacemaker would change like the heart rate. And so like taking such a different view of looking at a disease like Parkinson's from the brain state and thinking how do we change the brain state to affect all of these side effects, you know?
Yeah, because you could probably use that for like aphasia too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that like how I would want to use it is that, like, considering that we can slip into a creative state, and since that is such a different state of mind and it has such different processes in our brain, like, we could find different ways for people, like, say, like, we do have someone with aphasia, we could find a way for them to communicate creatively. Like, it may not just be like just a normal conversation, but they could still like use that creative state of mind that's so separate and so different from everything else, and either communicate through songs, through music, through like narratives, poetry, because like even if you think about it, like they could be able to communicate like in a spoken word like setting, like if they were able to like tap into the creative state of mind and like create poems and have their speaking be more rhythmic or poetic. I think that would be a new way to communicate that wouldn't be so limited just towards like just conversational. I think that would also require like more open-mindedness, but I think it would be something that could be considered looking into.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you said that, because I just had a thought right before you said that, and this is coming off the top of my head, so hopefully it's not ridiculous. But I was thinking about different brain states as it relates to like learning. So I've been thinking a lot about how the school system, especially like not necessarily college, but even like younger elementary, middle, or high school, you go to school and you're at school and you're learning, and you're forced to learn like in these hour and a half, 2 or 3 hour slots, and you sit there and you learn, and how that's not very conducive to the human brain. And if we were to step back again, it would require the open-mindedness of looking at learning through when are our brain states able to, like, when is our brain in a state able to learn, and realizing everyone's brain states are different. So as someone who was just recently diagnosed with ADHD, I'm thinking about when I was in high school, middle school, elementary school, and there were times when I could really hyper-focus and really start to understand, but lots of times where I had to do school but I couldn't. It didn't make any sense to me because my brain wasn't, potentially, I'm assuming my brain wasn't in that state, you know.
Well, and once you figure out what state it is that you can hyper-focus in, it's almost like going back to like that pacemaker for the brain. You can stimulate that state of mind in order to get and you could figure out like what triggers that state of mind in order to better, and that would help a lot just with learning disabilities.
Yeah, and imagine the difference it would make in the educational system
Mm-hmm.
if we were to step back and look at not how is our society structured in a 9 to 5 setting, but
Right,
how can we become the most creative that we can be.
right. What did you think was like the most inspiring about the video?
I think the idea that we can like train ourselves to be more creative,
Yeah.
that we can tap into those states and become more creative, more human almost even. And
Yeah.
I think that's the other interesting thing too, was that creativity is such a human aspect, you
Mhm.
know, and it's not just like there's creative people and there's not, but like creativity is
Everyone is
everywhere and
creative,
it's such like a shared aspect of humanity. I thought that was
Yeah.
really interesting.
Mine was really similar. I liked how he said that we can all become little Da Vinci's. I
Yeah.
thought that was cool.
Yeah.
Just because like I've never really thought about that. Just because like I spent most of my life thinking that I wasn't creative.
Yeah.
And I just was like, I'm not a creative person, so I never really like even tried to engage in like writing or painting or like anything that I deemed like super creative, just because either I had been told my whole life that like I wasn't creative, or I just like felt like that wasn't something that I had. And then I started writing last year, and I was like, oh man,
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like crazy.
You
how,
love it.
Yeah, I was like crazy how I actually am
Yeah.
creative. But I think that's cool that he mentioned that, because I think that if we were all to have that mindset, and if we were
Yeah.
all to encourage that mindset,
Right.
people would probably find a creative outlet
Yeah.
that they were good at a lot sooner. Because it took me until I was 20 years old to even find out that I could write. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I think if I would have heard that encouragement, like, oh, we're all like little Da Vinci's. We all have some creative, like we are all creative. We just have to find like the creative state, and we also have to find like our method of like exerting this creativity
Yeah.
that suits us the best.
Yeah. For
So
sure.
that was cool.
Sorry we went over time,
It's
Janie.
okay. Thanks, Janny.
Bye.
You're the best.